Según esto, ya estamos en vivo. Adelante, Abel.
Ok, bueno, pues buenos días. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos aquí a esta sesión especial del Taller de Didáctica de la Lógica. En realidad, más bien es una sesión de la Academia Mexicana de Lógica con una temática más teórica. Y es realmente un privilegio y un honor y un gusto enorme que podamos contar con una perspectiva un poco diferente a la filosófica que normalmente prevalece entre nosotros. En esta ocasión le agradecemos a Oliver Marshall, al doctor Fabio Miranda y a la doctora Lourdes del Carmen González Huesca, que nos están acompañando y van a más bien a guiar estas reflexiones y discusión de este simposio sobre lógica, sobre lenguaje, lógica y computación. Y pues les agradecemos mucho que hayan tenido la oportunidad, se hayan dado la oportunidad y preparado estos materiales. Esperamos que esto sea el inicio de una colaboración importante, pues la academia realmente necesita expandir sus horizontes y nos da muchísimo gusto que estén con nosotros esta mañana. Quiero dejarle a Lourdes que haga una breve presentación y continuaremos con Oliver Marshall. Gracias y bienvenidos. Este espacio es para todos y es un honor tenerlos aquí nuevamente. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Muchas gracias también a Lourdes y Fabio por colaborar conmigo y la Academia de Lógica también por esta oportunidad de compartir nuestras ideas.
I just want Lourdes to make a brief introduction before you go, Oliver.
Yes.
Just to make a brief presentation and then you follow. Thank you.
Okay.
Gracias también. De nuestra parte les damos las gracias a la Academia, al Taller de Didáctica de la Lógica. Somos colegas y colaboradores en ambas asociaciones y también quiero agradecer enormemente la disposición, el entusiasmo y la energía de Oliver para crear este espacio y también para tener futuras colaboraciones con el resto de los miembros de la academia, y en general esperamos que esto sea una invitación a que mucha gente que hace filosofía, no nada más en México, que también hacen lógica en Latinoamérica o en América o en todo el mundo, nos acompañen y que esto sea el principio de muchas cosas. I just want to apologize because we are half talking in Spanish and half talking in English. Sorry, Melvin Pitting, that is in the audience here. I didn't know that he will be a guest in this session, but I hope at least something of the things that we are going to talk about are clear enough, or in Spanish, clear enough for him. And we are open to suggestions and comments about the topics we are going to speak today. And so thank again everyone here at the Academia Mexicana de Lógica and Taller de Didáctica de la Lógica. And now it's the time for Oliver to start our session, and welcome everybody.
Well, just before, again, Oliver, I do believe that we don't need to apologize in speaking either language, Spanish or English. So you are welcome, to speak in English and in Spanish. I mean, if we can do it or if you can do it, it's fine. And I think it will be important at the end of the Oliver's presentation if you, Lourdes, can make a brief summary of that in Spanish as well. And for the persons that are English speakers here joining us, I think it will be important also to have briefly some words that can explain what is being presented. So, en español, realmente pues este es un espacio plural, abierto. Yo no creo que nunca en la vida hay que pedirle disculpas a nadie si hablamos en español o en inglés. Debemos de honrar lo que sabemos y lo que somos y aceptarnos como estamos y buscar canales de comunicación. Entonces, les pediría a los que van a presentar, Oliver va a presentar en inglés, Lourdes ya le pedí que haga una pequeña reseña al final, E igual a los que van a estar presentando en español, si ya han reconocido que tenemos invitados en inglés, pues darles una pequeña síntesis al final. Y bueno, pues bienvenidos otra vez. Muchas gracias por todo y el espacio es suyo.
Excuse me, Oliver, you are muting.
Later on, I'm going to give a philosophical talk. But I just wanted to begin by just giving a very short introduction to what I think Lourdes and Fabio and I are all interested in, so you can get a sense of the whole project that we're trying to start. So just as one of the things I really learned first in graduate school was that there's this extraordinary history of feedback between mathematics and philosophy, and especially the philosophy of language. And so here I just begin with a very general picture of what I'll call this sort of feedback loop, where ideas originate in mathematics, they make their way into logic, and from there into what I would call the general philosophy of language, which may be relevant to both ordinary spoken language and to formal languages. And from there, they make their way into the foundations of mathematics. And then certainly a great deal in the old days, that would then have an effect on mathematics again. And I think it's possible that we've come upon something here in this session where once again, the impact on mathematics might be restored, but this will all be stuff that we have to work out. So let me just give a couple of examples. So Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, and Saul Kripke all formulated either theories or pictures of language that somehow shaped their views in the foundations of mathematics. So I have in mind Frege's distinctions between Sinn and Bedeutung, or sense and denotation, and also between object and concept, or object and function. Russell's theory of denoting phrases and incomplete symbols and propositional functions in his famous paper on denoting and then on mathematical logic and the theory of types. There's Wittgenstein's picture of rules as hardened irregularities, which he explores in his remarks on the foundations of mathematics and the arguably even more important lectures on the foundations of mathematics. And then there's Kripke's proposal to represent arithmetic in ZF set theory, which reflects the centrality of de re or singular, object-dependent reference to his picture of language. And so this is an idea that Saul had been toying with since about 1990, and it finally came out. There's a version of it, just came out in a volume in honor of Mark Steiner. So let me just now go back to a picture of this sort of feedback loop. Let me just give the example of Frege, right? Because what's really the genius of Frege and Russell and Kripke was that they were able to draw on their experience as mathematicians and then bring those ideas into philosophy of language, and then the philosophy of language had an impact on foundations. So let's just take Frege as an example, his distinction between object and function. So we begin with his observation in mathematics that functions can take more and more kinds of numbers as arguments. So we have not only positive and numbers and zero, we have negative, rational, real, and eventually the complex numbers are taken as argument. And so then he moves to logic and the more generally applicable idea that functions can take any object whatsoever as argument. And from that, we get Frege's compositional theory of denotation. We have arguments and truth values. The propositional connectives are functions from pairs of truth values to truth values. The predicates are replaced by functions from objects to truth values. Quantifiers are functions from objects to truth values, and so on. And then this is reflected in his foundational.
Excuse me, you're muting? Okay.
No, someone muted me. Anyway, this is then made his way into his Begriffsschrift, which is his first axiomatic presentation of logic. And that suffices to prove non-trivial theorems of order theory, most notably about the ancestral of a relation. And then, of course, axiomatic systems in turn had an effect on mathematics again. So that's the kind of feedback loop I have in mind. Now, another example, which is really what we're all interested in, is this way this feedback works in the work of Alonzo Church, and then people like Martin Loff and Lourdes, who are influenced by Church. So we begin again with a mathematical question. Can we not only find the answer to a given mathematical problem, but can we effectively or mechanically calculate the answer? That's the questions that mathematicians ask about certain problems. This led Church and Alan Turing to ask, well, what is an effective or a mechanical calculation anyway? Well, Church answered that the effectively calculable functions are the lambda definable functions. And then Church augmented his sort of philosophy of language with a lambda calculus, and he described both Phrygian and Russellian typed intentional languages. This in turn originally had an impact on the dependent type theory. So I have in mind people like Martin Loff and I suppose Thierry Coquand might be included in that tradition. And now this has had an effect on computer-assisted proofs. For example, the system Lean, which is studied by Caniero, for example. And I don't think it would be too rash to speculate that probably computer-assisted proofs will continue to have more effect on mathematics, although I suspect and I hope that informally rigorous mathematics will go on as usual. I'm sure that nevertheless, computer-assisted formalization will play an increased role. Now, obviously, in this last diagram, computer science has entered the feedback loop. And moreover, linguistics is also sort of a byproduct of these feedback loops, since Frege's work on compositionality originally helped to give birth to formal semantics and linguistics more generally. So if we start with this part of the loop here, and then we can sort of see as an offshoot of that. So we have Church's typed intentional languages augmented with the lambda calculi. Then people like Lourdes have investigated lambda calculi and functional programming languages. And then this had effects both on formal philosophical semantics, the sort you see in work by Nathan Salmon and Scott Soames, but also in linguistics, where people like Barbara Partee, Irina Heim, Angelica Kratza, and more recently Chris Barker, Simon Charlo, make very heavy use of ideas from the lambda calculus and functional programming languages. So what I think is going on here, and it's really what we want to investigate, is that Church's work has really influenced a new emerging general philosophy of language, which very much like the philosophies of Frege, Russell, and Kripke, has implications for both natural language via linguistics and the foundations of mathematics. And so this is what Lourdes and Fabio and I propose to investigate. So a couple of things. Next semester, every other Thursday at 12 in Mexico City time, Lourdes will hold a hybrid Zoom in-person workshop where we'll invite some speakers and try and begin to sort this rich subject matter through. We've also, for students, we've also advertised a class which people are encouraged to sign up for. And of course, so Lourdes and Fabio bring expertise from UNAM's Faculty of Sciences, I think in both computer science and mathematics. And I'm at the Institute and I work on the history and philosophy of logic and some relevant parts of the philosophy of mathematics and the philosophy of language, especially Church. So I think we're a good team to work on this together, but it's going to be a large and difficult collaborative exercise. But anyway, this is the basic subject that I wanted to introduce to you today. And I will be giving an informal philosophical talk later about some of the history of this stuff. So I think I'll turn it over to Lourdes at this point.
Yes. Gracias, Oliver. Solamente para hacer un resumen rápido en español de lo que explicó Oliver. Esta colaboración y esta retroalimentación entre las matemáticas y otras áreas lo estamos tratando de rescatar, sobre todo esta retroalimentación de las teorías de funciones o teorías basadas un poco en el cálculo lambda, que están originalmente propuestas por Alonso Church y que a lo largo de todo este últimos 100 años aproximadamente han tenido ramificaciones importantes y que esas teorías o esas nuevas teorías han dado pie a construir, sobre todo del lado de computación, ciertas herramientas o ciertas teorías que nos permiten hablar de resolver problemas en general, ya sea matemáticamente o computacionalmente. Pero esta retroalimentación también la queremos aprovechar como un marco teórico y como una base especial para entender o atacar problemas de filosofía del lenguaje. Entonces, sobre todo aquí este feedback, esta retroalimentación que tiene aquí, este ciclo de retroalimentación, es como en la que nos interesa más. Y sobre todo, lo que queremos es rescatar esta influencia de Church en las cosas o la influencia que puede tener ahora en lingüística también, en filosofía del lenguaje. Para eso es que estamos organizando el siguiente semestre un seminario que es abierto a todo el público. Sobre todo, buscamos que sea abierto para el modo híbrido, desarrollarlo en modo híbrido, y ahorita también en la presentación que voy a hacer, espero aclarar un poco más las ideas sobre este seminario. Entonces, no sé si hasta aquí alguien quiera comentar algo o hacer alguna pregunta para Oliver, ¿sí? Sobre todo. O si no, pues avanzamos y les presentamos un poco más en forma qué pasa con estas herramientas o con estas teorías computacionales y matemáticas para poder empezar a hablar un poco más del seminario.
Sí, yo creo que puedes seguir ahora y luego ya tendremos más dudas.
Sí, ya veo que
Gracias.
todo está bien. Ok. Entonces hice una pequeña presentación. Nada más que en modo presentación. Esta es un poco del trabajo que hacemos aquí, Fabio y yo, en el Departamento de Matemáticas, en el área de computación teórica y en la subárea o en la intersección entre lenguajes o fundamentos de lenguajes de programación y lógica. ¿Qué pasa con la lógica y sobre todo con la lógica matemática, como nos la enseñan aquí en la facultad o en las escuelas dedicadas a matemáticas o escuelas también de computación que tienen que ver con computación? Pues nos enseñan que la lógica matemática pues es el lenguaje o es el fundamento de las matemáticas, ¿no? Y esto data ya de mucho tiempo atrás. Pero lo que nosotros usamos la lógica en las ciencias de la computación es para sustentar y mejorar muchas teorías y muchas áreas de computación. Entonces, entre ellas están muchísimas áreas de computación teórica, no nada más cosas de lenguajes de programación. Está la teoría de complejidad, de computabilidad, inclusive la teoría de modelos, bases de datos, etcétera. Y aquí nosotros nos enfocamos en un poco la teoría de la demostración, fundamentos de programación y asistentes de prueba o verificación asistida. Entonces, todo esto, sobre todo la verificación asistida, está tomando demasiada fuerza o demasiada importancia en áreas de matemáticas y de ciencias de la computación, pero todo esto se reduce o está fundamentado en la lógica o en el uso de la lógica, digamos que de cierta forma práctica, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cómo queremos usar todavía más o expandir el uso de la lógica en la práctica, no nada más en la práctica computacional, sino que con esta idea de este feedback, de esta retroalimentación de las matemáticas y de la computación, cómo podemos expandirlo a otras áreas, no nada más matemáticas, sino también, como nos comentó Oliver, tratar de ocupar estos mecanismos o estas nociones de computación en filosofía. Entonces, pues un poco el área en la que nos especializamos es la de teoría de tipos, y podemos decir que este es como un marco o una teoría conceptual para el diseño, el análisis y la implementación de lenguajes de programación. Lo que buscamos con los tipos, con esta teoría de tipos, un poco inspirada en los trabajos de Russell y también de Martin Love, es que queremos abstraer rasgos computacionales o rasgos de cálculo a través de los tipos y que estos sean transparentes en los lenguajes de programación y que los usuarios o los programadores puedan sacar provecho de estos lenguajes. Esta teoría de tipos está fuertemente basada en sistemas de deducción a la Gensen, es decir, sistemas de razonamiento o de encadenamiento de razonamiento, como los conocemos en lógica. Estos sistemas de deducción precisamente establecen un lenguaje formal para la argumentación y el razonamiento válido. Buscamos, obviamente, no nada más hacer razonamiento, sino que sean válidos para obtener programas correctos. Y esta también es el fundamento de los asistentes o los demostradores de teoremas. Entonces, también estos sistemas nos permiten crear ambientes idóneos para las demostraciones. De la mano con esa teoría de tipos, con la lógica que está detrás, existe una correspondencia con un modelo de cómputo que es el cálculo lambda, que también tiene esta fundamentación en el trabajo de Church. Entonces, por ahí ya pueden imaginar que tenemos o queremos conectar todo esto, que es la correspondencia, ahorita lo que vamos a hablar, la correspondencia Curry-Howard, para poder hacer ir y venir o esta retroalimentación entre cosas de lógica y cosas de lenguajes y eventualmente trasladarlo a otras aplicaciones. Entonces, ahorita Fabio les va a hablar un poco de qué pasa aquí con esto y ahorita continúo.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to talk a little bit in English, maybe later in Spanish. So we are talking here about formalized mathematics using logic as the tool. Yeah. So for example, we have a theorem, and the usual proof in logic is this form. Yeah. So it's a sequence of steps justified in some ways using the inference rules. But this is a very rigid definition and does not correspond to mathematical practice at the end. Yeah? So to put it in a colloquial way, the mathematicians don't care about the logical form of their proofs. And here we're interested in, as Oliver's show in this loop, in computer-assisted proofs, which is the new actor in the loop. Yeah. And in particular, using Curry-Howard, which is the basis of proof assistants or interactive theorem provers, which means that formulas are types and proofs are programs or terms, formal programs, lambda terms from a quite sophisticated lambda calculus. And well, from the side of the philosophy of mathematical practice or the philosophy of mathematics, this we want to explore this idea of what are the difference between proving and programming, in the sense that using a proof assistant, you can say, I am programming. Yeah, and the language is some kind of functional programming enhanced with facilities to do proof in the same environment. But you can also say that you are proving, and this is the point of formalized mathematics. And so a general question is, what is the difference between formal verification, for example, of an algorithm, let's say a sorting algorithm, to formally verify that it really sorts, or to prove some theorem of group theory, for example. So this discussion, we already have one paper about it, which is called, or the concept or the word we use to conciliate the two kinds of proof. So the idea is that you have a traditional paper and pencil proof, and then you have an audience that says, okay, this proof is okay. On the other hand, you have a computer-assisted proof, which a different audience says, okay, it's okay, but it's a proof of the same result. So how can you relate this proof? Yeah, and here it's only a door which is now open, and inside there is a lot of interesting questions. Yeah, let me see these slides. What I see here. Yeah, that's what I say. No, the Curry-Howard. No, what is a proof of A implies B? It's a function, a procedure that transforms a proof of A in a proof of B. Of course, we are talking about constructive logic at the beginning of this. These are details that I don't know if it's okay to go inside them. This is the most powerful, quite powerful lambda calculus. This is the dependent types, because, okay, I'm not going to give details. Let me say something that it's also an interest of us, which is related with how to begin doing formalized mathematics. And this is, of course, related with a new language, and I am quite sure that there are some interesting issues related with linguistics and philosophy of language, but I don't know about them, because the entry barrier to using proof assistant is quite difficult. It's hard, because the manuals usually are not clear, and I'm thinking about a student of mathematics at the middle of the studies. Yeah, it's difficult. But it's difficult, and here's a point related to language, because the language is dark, let me say, yeah. So this idea of conciliate, something that I can say is how related to how to do proofs. We do proofs in the blackboard, like going forward and backwards, yeah. And the formal systems of logic, the formal definition of derivation is a forward derivation. You start with axioms or hypotheses and do inferences, and at the end, you arrive at the conclusion. The usual thing in proof assistance is, well, this is questionable, but I can say it's backward proof, or it's a combination of forward and backward. Yeah, by the way, forward proof is related with the CUT rule in sequence calculus. Yeah, and this is an interesting thing, technical thing. To the best of our knowledge, for backward proof has not been formalized as a formal system, only as a heuristic thing. So we have some work doing some formalization of language of backward or a formalism of backward proof, which is inspired by one. The only one definition I know of formal definition of backward proof is from Stick-Kanger in some of his works, but it's not an operational definition. Yeah, it's just okay. I start with the conclusion and then I do backward reasoning and I end in actions. Yeah, and there is no way to distinguish if you see a derivation if the derivation was forward or backwards. It's the same. So let me see what else. Yeah, this is the lambda cube. So this is very different systems of lambda calculus. On this side, we have the propositional ones. This is a simple type lambda calculus. This is the most basic one, maybe the one some of you are familiar with. This corresponds to minimal intuitionistic logic. That is, we have only implication. Here we have second order propositional logic, higher order propositional logic, and so on. And here is the counterpart in the case of predicator. So this is the most powerful system. So usually this is called the calculus of constructions. The proof assistants we are talking about are based on this one. And here is an interesting question about language, because this is very powerful language where so we are used to say at the beginning that, okay, there are quite different and separated categories, the terms and the types, or using Korehauer, the proofs and the formulas corresponding to the proofs. But that at this level, they mix. That's why they are polydependent. And they mix in a very obscure way, which is very difficult to master. So here there is an interesting question about, I think the philosophy of language can say a lot about how to justify, or I don't know if that's the right way to handle this thing. Yeah? And of course, these are all logics which are consistent. Yeah, the language is mixed, but these logics are consistent. Let me see what else. Here's formal verification. Yeah, maybe Lourdes can go on. Okay.
Ok, entonces retomando un poco estos lenguajes, obviamente el cálculo lambda es más o menos bien conocido. El hecho de estudiar las otras vertientes o los otros refinamientos del cálculo lambda hasta llegar al cálculo de construcciones inductivas o el cálculo con tipos dependientes, permite que este lenguaje tan elaborado o tan, como dice Fabio, tan oscuro, digamos, sea tan expresivo que permite describir cualquier propiedad o cualquier característica de los programas. Entonces, digamos que la implementación de estos cálculos lambda en asistentes de prueba permiten hacer la verificación formal. Y la verificación formal busca que las propiedades de un programa, las propiedades deseables de algún programa, se puedan verificar y que se cumplen en todas las posibles ejecuciones. Y esta tarea es demasiado gigantesca o demasiado difícil de completar. Entonces, aquí estamos hablando de diferentes lenguajes. Queremos empatar las abstracciones de los programas con la verificación formal. Y a través de las implementaciones, ver que se cumple la especificación y que el programa construido o hecho, o el sistema de software que nos interesa, o inclusive alguna otra teoría o algún otro lenguaje, cumplen las especificaciones. Entonces, hay muchas maneras en ciencias de la computación de hacer verificación formal. No me voy a meter en esto porque tampoco es parte del simposio, pero lo que nos interesa es precisamente, escribir esos programas correctos por construcción usando estos cálculos o estos lenguajes demasiado expresivos. Volvemos otra vez un poco a que la lógica está como en todos lados, ¿no? Entonces, en todas estas herramientas para la verificación formal hay una lógica correspondiente que sustenta las herramientas y los sistemas para hacer verificación. Y lo que buscamos es que todas estas herramientas o todas estas lógicas podamos explotarlas o usarlas para otras áreas. Entonces, por ejemplo, la verificación de modelos utiliza lógicas temporales o lógicas no clásicas, si lo quieren ver así, para representar estados de los sistemas. La verificación deductiva, obviamente eso creo que la mayoría del público está familiarizado con los resolvedores o los solucionadores de satisfacibilidad. Y si nos vamos más allá, pues tratar de tener estos sistemas o estos ambientes interactivos o automáticos para conducir demostraciones. Entonces, la lógica está ahí en muchas partes, en todas estas herramientas para la verificación formal. Y lo que nos está ofreciendo este fundamento lógico es tener los razonamientos o poder realizar razonamientos correctos en estas áreas. ¿Cómo podemos ocupar también estas lógicas o estos diferentes sistemas, pues digamos, de lenguaje? ¿Cómo los podemos ocupar en la filosofía, ¿no? ¿Cómo podemos sacar provecho de ellos para la filosofía? Entonces, parte de este simposio es también invitarlos y darles a conocer este nuevo proyecto para estudiar la lógica y el lenguaje, cómo podemos sacar provecho de ambos, digamos, de esta retroalimentación, tratar de encontrar un ciclo de retroalimentación entre lógica y lenguaje, pero no nada más la lógica tal cual, sino con cosas de fundamentos de lenguajes de programación. Entonces, lo que queremos es usar los métodos formales, es decir, estos lenguajes o estos lenguajes de programación, estos cálculos lambda o estos sistemas deductivos o los sistemas de tipos como marco teórico para estudiar cuestiones de filosofía lógica y de lingüística. La teoría de tipos simples, tal vez, puede ser una base para estudiar la semántica intencional, es un poco las ideas que tenemos, y eventualmente entender mejor estas ideas de computación teórica trasladadas a cosas de filosofía del lenguaje. Entonces, para eso es que estamos proponiendo un seminario sobre teoría del lenguaje y fundamentos del lenguaje de programación, que es un poco el que presentó Oliver al final de su intervención, de su primera intervención. Y este seminario es el que vamos a tener aquí en la Facultad de Ciencias el siguiente semestre, todos los jueves, entre agosto y septiembre. Próximamente voy a poner más detalles de las sesiones y sobre todo la manera en que podremos, que la gente que quiera participar de forma no presencial o de forma a distancia pueda incorporarse a las sesiones por Zoom. Y pues eventualmente que nos acompañen y que también podamos crear más lazos. Entonces, Entonces, esta es la página principal del proyecto que tengo, que es de métodos formales y razonamiento, y que es parte, que el seminario más bien es parte de este proyecto. Entonces, los invito a que, o les invito a que se den una vuelta por ahí y vean un poco más de qué va este proyecto y el seminario, para que puedan acompañarnos. Y pues ya nada más para cerrar, comentarles pues que justamente estamos tratando de entender cómo los métodos formales nos ayudan a mejorar el razonamiento, o cómo nos permiten, o cómo eventualmente pueden cambiar nuestra manera de hacer razonamientos o de hacer demostraciones. Entonces, la verificación formal es eso, es esa parte que está tomando demasiada fuerza tanto en matemáticas como en ciencias de la computación, y que no nada más nos ayudan a expandir nuestras capacidades de verificación y mecanización, es decir, ocupar la computadora para que esta sea nuestra herramienta de trabajo, nuestra herramienta para hacer demostraciones, sino que también estos asistentes de prueba tenemos la idea, al menos la hemos estado o la estamos explorando, de que estos asistentes de prueba también modifican un poco la forma en que hacemos razonamientos, o cómo nos ayudan a modificar nuestra manera o nuestra práctica matemática de hacer demostraciones, ¿no? Entonces, pues este proyecto, este seminario también lo que busca es tratar de abonar o de tener nuestras colaboraciones para tratar de resolver o de ayudar a mejorar estos puntos que están aquí abajo, que es un poco el dar a conocer más estas herramientas o estos métodos formales como los asistentes de prueba, decirles que la verificación formal de programas es una parte importante, también no nada más los programas, sino también ayudar a formalizar todas las matemáticas, crear lazos con otras áreas, por ejemplo, con filosofía, y eventualmente, en el mismo sentir de la Academia Mexicana de Lógica y del taller de didáctica de la lógica, impulsar el uso de la lógica en las carreras afines y en la educación superior, o inclusive en la educación media superior, ¿no? Que yo sé que hay muchos participantes y mucha gente involucrada en este tipo de impulsar el uso de la lógica en muchas áreas, ¿no? No nada más en carreras científicas, pero también desde el uso en la preparatoria o desde la secundaria, ¿no? Entonces, esa es un poco nuestra presentación de esto. Les puedo dejar, aquí están nuestros correos, nos pueden contactar, nos pueden buscar, y eventualmente les pasaré los datos del seminario para que se distribuyan y se comuniquen a toda la gente interesada que forma parte de la academia y del taller de didáctica de la lógica. Entonces, llegamos hasta aquí. No sé si haya comentarios o alguna pregunta, y si no, Oliver puede continuar con su otra intervención.
Can I just make a remark?
Yes, Oliver, please.
So this is just obviously sort of we're all new to one or more aspects of this, but just in case any of the students are new to all of this, I'd just like to make a comment on Fabio's very helpful presentation, which is that the basic issue here is that what distinguishes mathematics from other kinds of argumentation is that it's rigorous, right? But then the question is, what do we mean by rigorous? And if you open a mathematics journal, what you'll see is arguments in a very precise the dialect of English or Spanish or French with added mathematical notation. And there is no doubt that the arguments are rigorous, but they're not formally rigorous. If you open a logic journal or a work in set theory or other foundations of mathematics, you will see, instead of informal rigor, you'll see formal rigor, right? So the issue is about two kinds of rigor. And then it can be approached from two different perspectives. If you're a philosopher interested in informal mathematics, the question is, well, if these arguments aren't formally rigorous, why exactly are they justified? And this you might appeal to the meaning, to the content, to the syntax, some mixture of these things. It's a very complicated question. Looked at from the other perspective, it's a question about the application of logic. The question for logicians prior to computerized mathematics was, well, if mathematicians simply don't use set theory or type theory when giving their arguments, then why is logic applicable to this subject? And now that second question is really a very ancient question, right? Because Aristotle did not have the logic to capture Euclid's arguments. And so the entirety of Euclid's elements is stated informally without any appeal to logic whatsoever. So the issue, so there's just two perspectives on the same problem. For the informal mathematician, it's a question of justification, or the person who philosophizes about informal mathematics. The question is about justification. For the logician, it's a question about the application of formal methods to mathematics. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Oliver. I don't know if it's...
I think you have a question.
Yes, I saw someone raise hand. Yes, Alejandro.
Hi, everyone. I don't know if I should speak in English, but anyway, I think that we are more like the Spanish-speaking people here, so I will do it in...
Yes, feel free.
Feel free. Spanish. Okay, so, bueno, muchas gracias. La verdad es que el proyecto es sumamente interesante. Sinceramente, como alguien con una formación en filosofía, tenía mucho tiempo esperando que hubiera una colaboración de este estilo interdisciplinaria. Y bueno, enhorabuena, la verdad es que qué bueno que están haciendo este proyecto. Quería hacer un par de preguntas, en realidad. No sé, quizá pensé que era muy temprano para hacerlas, quizás debería haber esperado hasta que terminara. Entiendo que ahora Oliver dará una plática más de tono filosófico, pero bueno, decidí hacerlas ahora por lo siguiente. Me preguntaba, o sea, según entiendo, yo estoy muy interesado en estas cuestiones de demostración asistida e interactiva, ¿no? Y también en la automática, ¿no? Esto que llaman los ATPs y los ITPs. Y entonces, Automated Theorem Provers y Interactive Theorem Provers, ¿no? Entonces, según recuerdo, pues bueno, en lo automatizado, los sistemas que se usan son de resolución o tableau, ¿no? De ese tipo. Y en los ITPs, en los Interactive Theorem Provers, justamente tenemos la correspondencia sería con deducción natural, ¿verdad? Con esta cuestión incluso de forward y backward. Yo estoy muy interesado en realidad en encontrar sistemas híbridos, que de hecho es lo que he estado platicando últimamente con Fabio, persona, en donde en realidad tenemos una cuestión de una mezcla entre tableau y deducción natural, que en realidad estos sistemas están basados en Corti, precisamente, y donde entra la parte también heurística, ¿no? De seleccionar, en este caso de estos sistemas, una fórmula que nos haga el trabajo fácilmente, ¿no? Y con fácilmente no lo digo en términos laxos, sino que en realidad hay una correspondencia con complejidad computacional, que yo entiendo que en matemáticas y en filosofía muchas veces a la gente no le interesa la complejidad. En realidad no he escuchado un argumento sólido al respecto, pero tampoco la teoría de la complejidad es que sea la más formal matemáticamente, justamente a propósito del rigor y todo ese tipo de cosas. Sin embargo, en la práctica, pues sí hay, digamos, está la tesis Cobat-Edmonds, en la que dice, bueno, lo que está en P es lo que podemos hacer de manera eficiente. Bueno, todo esto era en realidad para mencionar que, bueno, si ustedes están también interesados Lourdes mencionó en parte de su plática la complejidad, en el resto no la escuché y no sé si a ustedes les interese también. Esa es una pregunta, o sea, si la complejidad les parece como un componente en que la lógica puede ayudar o puede estar relacionada de manera sustancial? Esa es una primera una pregunta. Y un comentario sobre la integración de lógicas no clásicas a su programa, particularmente a propósito de las cosas de lingüística. Por ejemplo, se me ocurre con lógicas subestructurales, ¿no? El cálculo Lambek, por ejemplo. Me pregunto si lo tienen en mente o están pensando siempre en términos de lógica clásica y la correspondencia con Howard respecto a lógica clásica. Y bueno, finalmente un comentario que también sería una cosa que me parece muy interesante y que está de moda, en boga ahorita, es pues la cuestión de la transparencia justamente que la lógica puede dar en esto que llaman explainable AI, ¿no? Porque es transparente para seres humanos y además en ese sentido pues puede ser escrutinada legal y éticamente, ¿no? Entonces, pues bueno, parece que es pues un campo que está en crecimiento y que muy interesante, con implicaciones también legales y éticas, por supuesto. Pero bueno, muchas gracias y es muy interesante el proyecto.
Pues sí, cosas de complejidad, pues ahorita estamos como atacando un problema a la vez, ¿no? Cosas de complejidad, pues digo, ahorita el poder computacional con el que contamos nos hace un poco olvidarnos de lo complejo que puede ser un algoritmo o de su, digamos, como los recursos computacionales que puede gastar. Entonces, estamos ahorita un poco dejando ese problema de lado. Respecto a, ya se me olvidó la segunda, pero la última que es, no, los segundos de cosas híbridas, ¿no? Si no mal recuerdo.
Sí.
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 Cosas híbridas, bueno, eso también es como otra área que tendremos que poner ahí en la lista de cosas por hacer, pero sí es algo bastante interesante y yo espero que con tu colaboración podamos trabajar a un poco este tema y eventualmente, ¿qué fue lo último? Ahora ya se me olvidó la última,
Bueno,
de las lógicas
no
clásicas,
subestructurales.
otras lógicas, ¿no? Justo también estoy tratando de abrir esas colaboraciones, tratar de ver qué pasa con lógicas relevantes, igual con lógica modal, digamos, lógica epistémica. Entonces, tenemos como un abanico de cosas por hacer y esperemos que este proyecto y el seminario nos ayuden a crear las colaboraciones para atacar estos y tratar de resolver estos problemas. Gracias, Alejandro.
Gracias a ustedes.
Ahora creo que está Miguel.
Hi, everyone. I'm very grateful that people from science and philosophy collaborate. I congratulate Lourdes, Fabio, and Oliver. I have a very simple question. As you mentioned in the session, mathematicians are not interested in formalizing mathematical proofs. That is a fact. With this in mind, what do you think will be the benefit for mathematical practice of formalizing all mathematics using something like simple type theory or homotopy type theory or another formal system? Just that.
The reason is that in contemporary mathematical practice, if you want to prove a theorem in one subject area, you're allowed to help yourself to results in another subject area, right? So this is sometimes called indirectness of a method. But if you're going to do that, you better be sure that the axioms of subject area A are consistent with the axioms of subject area B. Otherwise, you have nonsense. Sorry, I'm a classical person, right? And the reason we think that, say, the axioms of subject area A are consistent with the axioms of subject area B is because they can all be encoded into set theory, and we believe that set theory is consistent. So that's the point of when you see before, if you open a set theory textbook, before you get to the stuff about the different infinities, there's these 4 or 5 chapters about encoding, arithmetic, and real analysis into set theory. And that's the reason that we do this. Geometry can be encoded into arithmetic, and arithmetic can be, all of it can then be encoded into set theory. So the idea is it's a comprehensive framework which increases our confidence that what we're doing is consistent. Does that help?
Yes, thank you, Oliver.
So the point is that the axioms of subject area A and subject area B become theorems of set theory, right? And we hope set theory is consistent, and therefore that our use of indirect method is also consistent.
Okay, thank you.
I can say something related.
Just please, yes.
Yeah. The question is that how there is this phenomenon in mathematics, which is to prove again the same theory. Yeah. You can collect, for example, proofs of Pythagoras theorem or and so on. And some proofs are quite disjoint, yeah? For example, the fundamental theorem of algebra. You can give a proof of which is algebraic, or you can give it as a corollary of the Liouville theorem of complex variables, yeah? So there is this book by, if I remember correctly, John Dawson, which is called How to Prove It Again, yeah? Why to prove it again? And related with computer-assisted proofs and with this thing that I mentioned before, that what is the status of a computer-assisted proof in comparison with a paper and pencil proof? There is some interesting phenomena. First, the same phenomenon will occur? So if you prove some theorem with proof assistant, then why to prove it again in another proof assistant? Yeah. If it is related with formal verification of an algorithm of a specific process, it sounds like, okay, it's already verified. Why to prove it again? Yeah. But if it's a thing in formalized mathematics, then it can give you more insights into the theory. Yeah. Some new methods of proof, for example. And I say that because we already did that in some case study related with modal logic. So the native tools of the proof assistant say do induction on something, let's say a context, and if you have this proof in the Blackboard, it never occurred to us that was the easy way to do it. Yeah, and that's a new proof. But there is another phenomenon with computer-assisted proofs, which is like they can be deprecated. Yeah, and this is a problem. So that's the difference. One clear difference in the two kinds of proofs. Because if you prove something in a version, in the current version of the system, maybe in 2 or 3 years this version is deprecated and your proof doesn't work again. Yeah, you cannot reproduce it. And now I recall this paper by Alan Robinson, which is proof equals guarantee plus explanation. So in some point he says like a proof of a mathematical theorem is like a symphony, a musical symphony, that you should be able to play it again, to reproduce it. And this is not the case if your proof is deprecated. So these are problems that are posed by these computer-assisted proofs, which are very interesting to explore. That's what I wanted to say.
Sorry, can I ask a question? So are you saying that there's a problem about getting the same proof assistant to replicate a proof it's already done?
Yeah.
Huh.
That for example, all proofs from the version like 10 years ago, you cannot reproduce
yes,
it.
right, because of the updating of the.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
And there is also the problem of and there is some work in that direction to communicate between two different proof assistants. Yeah, some translation. So I have this proof in some proof assistant, say Coq, and then I want to call it with Isabel or so on. And there, this communication is also an interesting phenomenon to explore. Yeah, and the consequences again in language.
I think it was Stephen Simpson said something similar on a blog. He was saying, look, the point is, the point about set theory is that we know we can encode everything into set theory, and we don't change the database or anything like that, and we can reproduce our formalized arguments and our checking of proofs again and again and again. But while there's this issue of constantly updating proof assistants, we lose the stability, which is sort of, you know, the point I made to Miguel's question is that you know, the uniqueness of mathematics is in the way that arguments can be checked, right? And set theory really ultimately provided that. And it seems what you're saying is that there's a current problem with computer assistants that we may lose some of that, the stability of our proof checking methods. Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. We have two more questions.
Raimundo, please.
Gracias. Nada más quería entender mejor el comentario de Fabio, porque yo estoy de acuerdo con él en que la reproducibilidad es un criterio epistémico importantísimo para hablar de la cientificidad, del uso de auxiliares mecánicos o inteligencia artificial, etcétera, en la aplicación de la lógica. Fabio, ¿pensarías tú que este problema se extiende también a los seres humanos, naturales, normales? Porque yo puedo hacer una prueba hoy y mañana, desgraciadamente, el Alzheimer me impide volver a hacerla. Hay cosas que yo probé hace 30 años que tal vez no pueda probar hoy. O bien, yo lo puedo probar, pero Axel o Alejandro tal vez no puedan, no se puede replicar en otro sistema. Todo esto parece que requiere un trabajo filosófico de qué es esa reproducibilidad que estamos buscando. No puede ser simplemente el mismo sistema lo podría hacer mañana, porque entonces no habría reproducibilidad realmente en un sentido fuerte. Entonces, ¿crees tú, Fabio, que este es un problema que rebasa el campo de los demostradores automáticos de teoremas, etcétera, pero que podemos explorar de manera especialmente clara con ellos? Y que las respuestas que encontremos para ese caso van a tener repercusiones incluso para nuestra idea de qué es la cientificidad, la reproducibilidad en ciencia, en todas las demás y en todas las demás circunstancias. ¿Qué tan importante crees, Fabio, que es este problema y qué tanto se extiende más allá de los ATPs? Gracias.
El ejemplo que das pues es bueno, ¿no? No necesito tener Alzheimer, o sea, yo veo un artículo que Luis y yo escribimos hace 10 años y yo no entiendo un caramba de lo que demostramos ahí, ¿no? Pero esto tiene que ver con reproducir. Se fue aquí la luz, a ver si no nos cortamos. El reproducir en el sentido, y por eso la analogía que hace Robinson es de una sinfonía, de que si yo tengo ciertos conocimientos, en caso de música, pues puedo leer la partitura y volver a ejecutarla. Ejecutar es una palabra a lo mejor más adecuada. ¿Sí?
Creo que se perdió la conexión de Fabio.
We lost Lourdes and Fabio. Perhaps we can continue with the participation of Alejandro.
Yeah, well, pienso que sí, pero es que también justo tenía que ver con esta cuestión entre pasar, entre comunicación, digamos, entre asistentes de prueba. Entonces supongo que era una pregunta dirigida a algo que había dicho Fabio. Entonces, pues, a ver si vuelven.
Okay. Anybody has another question?
Bueno, antes de que se vayan, por favor hagan su registro. Acabo de poner ahí una liga para que se registren de asistencia, por favor. Y bueno, podemos continuar.
Shall I?
Please sorry, just make a registration on the form that I just sent through the chat, please.
Yes, Oliver?
I was going to say, if we've lost Lourdes and Fabio, I could give my talk and then we can have a longer Q&A session at the end.
Okay, of course.
Fabio, are you there? No, okay, so why don't I proceed just so we're not wasting time and then we can talk more later. Okay, so I showed you these examples of feedback from mathematics to logic to what I call the general philosophy of language to the foundations of mathematics, and then traditionally feeding back into mathematics again. That was the general theme of the introduction I gave. So here's another such loop, which we're going to talk about this afternoon. So we begin with some problems that were raised by Hilbert. Two of them, well, one of them is every mathematical problem solvable? And another one is the theory of real numbers, real analysis, consistent? This led Hilbert to develop formal systems. And this immediately, because of the way that Hilbert proceeded, led to issues in the philosophy of language and epistemology. And that's really because the very basic idea of Hilbert is to use a meaningful and surveyable and epistemically secure meta-language, which is really so simple that it cannot fall into contradiction. And he tried to use this to prove the consistency of analysis. So that raises issues in epistemology and philosophy of language. Then from this attempt at formalism, paradox and independence results, most famously Gödel's incompleteness theorems, were discovered, partly due to the phenomenon of self-reference. This led to undecidability results, and this obviously then had an effect on mathematics again. And so I'm going to try and take us around this loop in Church's early work. Now, I would really encourage people to look at Church's philosophy of mathematics. It's so nice when you find a sort of satisfying arc or trajectory in a philosopher. Ramsey is another example. But there's this very nice trajectory where he starts off very early in his career writing informally rigorous mathematical papers of the kinds I described to Miguel earlier. You know, they're written in a dialect of English plus notation. The arguments are rigorous, but they're informal. Church visits Göttingen, where he meets Hilbert and Bernays and others. And like Bernays and Gödel and Herbrand, Church is in the late 20s and 30s, very influenced by Hilbert's formalist program, and then in particular, the problems that arose out of it, right? Which is really what we learned so much from. And then this leads him eventually to his mature view, which is what he calls a modest realism. It's neither Platonism nor what he calls the extreme realism of Frege and Gödel. It's another kind of realism. Well, obviously, I approve very much of this part of the arc, and this part of the arc, it bends towards truth in more than one sense. But today we're going to focus on the more problematic formalist part of Church's intellectual journey. Well, a reasonable question is why, right? Why do we care about a failed formalist program? Well, one reason is sort of scholarly. So the work by Hilbert and Bernays and Gödel and Herbrand is covered very thoroughly. And again, more recently in Paolo Mancusi's wonderful book, The Adventure of Reason. But it's just a very odd thing. He really didn't look at Church very much at all. And this is symptomatic of a broader phenomena, which is that Church's contributions, which, by the way, also led to very important contributions by his students, Clini and Rosser, who sort of critiqued Church's early work as it developed. So Church's early work and the problems in it led to Clini and Rosser's work. None of this has really received sufficient attention. So that's a sort of scholarly reason. We'll see another very interesting thing is that in the course of discussing the Ricard paradox, which I'll explain, Church arrives at a key idea, which he'll use to show that the decision problem for first-order logic is unsolvable. And for philosophers, well, just studying Church is incredibly illuminating because unlike many other figures of a similar stature, he often discusses in his logical papers, explicitly discusses the philosophical outlook that he weaves into his presentation of formal logic and formalized mathematics. And so for that reason, it can be very helpful. I'm going to talk about formalism. I'm going to try and keep this as informal as possible for philosophers. So I'm going to begin by talking about the influences on Church of Russell and Hilbert. So what's very striking about Church's attempt at formalism is that it's based on the idea of a function rather than that of a class. So we've mentioned set theory a couple of times today, where the basic idea in the formalism is the idea of a set. Well, Church's formalism is based on Russell's notion of a propositional function. So a function thought of as like a rule or something like that, a function in intension rather than a class. Russell is known for the view that classes are useful but eliminable instruments. They're logical fictions which can be helpful to use, but in principle they can be eliminated in Russell's theory, and everything can be done in terms of propositions and propositional functions. Well, Church does something extremely radical in his early work, which is he extends Russell's instrumentalism about classes to all entities of logic and mathematics, including propositions and propositional functions. So I was horrified when I saw this, actually. Church writes, these entities are essentially not a part of reality, but fictions devised for their usefulness as instruments in understanding reality. And in a slightly later paper, the entities of formal logic are abstractions invented because of their use in describing and systematizing facts of experience or observation. Ugh. Awful. Church is, of course, aware that making or devising these instruments requires thinking and understanding, and so in his view, grasping propositions. So that obviously raises the question now, if you need propositions to devise the instruments of mathematics, how can propositions be mere instruments? And here things get very interesting. Church immediately begins to display like great subtlety in his philosophical thinking. And first of all, he distinguishes what he calls formal logic, which to people who are familiar with Hilbert and work afterwards, we think of as the object language, right? The formal object language is distinguished from intuitive logic, which is the meta language. And the idea seems to be that only the propositions of intuitive logic are real rather than mere instruments. Okay, but so now the question is, why do we accept the distinction between the formal logic and intuitive logic? So here again, it's very helpful to look to Russell in the Principles of Mathematics, his first major book, where Russell emphasizes the need for inferring asserted propositions and how one must be able to do this if formalism is not to be inert. So Russell says a true hypothesis in an implication may be dropped and the consequent asserted. So that's something like detachment or modus ponens he has in mind. This is a principle incapable of formal statement and illustrating the essential limitations of formalism. And then in a later section on formal implication in the same book, Russell explicitly relates this remark to Lewis Carroll's famous regress argument about modus ponens. And now, so Church, I've looked through his collected works, and Church never cites Lewis Carroll's famous paper anywhere, but he has read Russell, and Russell does cite it explicitly. So it seems that Church is really influenced by Russell's reading of Lewis Carroll rather than by reading Lewis Carroll himself. So Church writes, formulas composed of symbols to which no meaning is attached cannot define a procedure of proof or justify an inference from one formula to another. If our postulates were expressed wholly by means of the symbols of formal logic, without the use of any words or symbols having a meaning, there would be no theorems except the postulates themselves. And I was very struck by this particular turn of phrase. The point seems to be that if one cannot grasp the propositions of intuitive logic and reason already prior to adopting the formalism, one would infer nothing from the formalism. So there's a famous example due to Saul Kripke of universal instantiation, right? Suppose I want to learn universal instantiation. So you say all universal statements imply their instances. Kripke points out that the inference from all universal statements imply their instances to this particular universal statement implies its instances is exactly the same as the inference from all ravens are black to this particular raven is black. So if you can't make the second inference already, being taught the first rule won't help you, right? I think that's a great example. And so, yeah, this this way of putting the thing that there would be no theorems except the axioms of themselves. Right? The formalism is inferentially inert without some other kind of ability. It seems that Church has sort of, through reading Russell, has independently discovered one of the points in there. There are sort of a number of related points which philosophers try to unpick here. But the basic idea is often credited to Quine in Truth by Convention, which is, I think, one of his best papers. But it seems that by studying Russell, Church had already come to some of Quine's main points himself. So the moral is we need to distinguish formal logic from intuitive logic, which is the knowledge and reasoning needed to talk about and use a very simple logical language. It consists of discrete surveyable expression types, so you can recognize an expression as the occurrence of the same expression again, and you can distinguish occurrences of distinct expression types. And it has very basic rules like universal instantiation and modus ponens and things like that. That's in intuitive logic. But an important thing is that if you look at the way Church describes his intuitive or logic or meta language in these early papers, it's clear that the propositions of intuitive logic are in some sense language dependent. They are always about linguistic expressions. And I will try to argue that this opens the door to conventionalism and ultimately a kind of nihilism in the light of a result that Church derives from Ricard's paradox. Church comes to the conclusion that the claim he derives from Ricard's paradox shows that there's no such thing as a logic, and that's what I mean by nihilism. And I'll argue that this may have its origin in the fact that intuitive logic is still language dependent. And the key thing to keep in mind here is the contrast with Russell. With Russell, the easiest way to understand Russell's philosophy, I've always thought, is just to think that a representation and reality are really the same thing. You are always thinking and talking about the world because you're asserting propositions that are composed of objective worldly things. That's, that's why he says that Mont Blanc is a constituent of the proposition, something Frege found very difficult to understand. Propositions are complex entities consisting of objective worldly entities. Then the part of Russell's language that is analogous to Church's a meta language or intuitive logic, in that one speaks only about thought and language, is simply a restricted case of this more general phenomenon. For Russell, simply the meta language is when you assert propositions about propositions. But that's just a special case of the more general phenomena of talking about the world. So I'm going to try and show that Church has made a mistake by steering away from this or ignoring this aspect of Russell's philosophy. So that's something about comparison and contrast with Russell. I'd also like to compare and contrast Church with Hilbert a bit. Like Hilbert, Church's goal is to use a secure, intuitive meta language to prove the consistency of a theory based on the object language. A contrast is that Hilbert and later Abraham Robinson insisted that the meta language should not acknowledge the existence of completed infinities, including the set of natural numbers. In contrast, Church allows his meta language, intuitive logic, to quantify over infinite domains, because he says the set of variables and formulas and proofs in his object language is enumerable. So he thinks that the basic idea is that Hilbert and Robinson wrestle with the idea that, look, if I don't have a certain amount of arithmetic, I can't really tell you what a formal system is. Right? The problem is, I don't really believe in these completed infinities, so I have to figure out a way of describing a formal system while simply using the natural numbers as sort of somehow a useful instrument that I don't really believe in. So Robinson tried to clarify this position. Church is taking the much more straightforward point of view, which is that since I need a meta language that quantifies over infinite domains since I need to quantify over infinite sets to tell you what my formal system is, I allow an infinite set into my meta language. One more point. We've already seen Church's view that propositions and reasoning of intuitive logic must be taken for granted already if you're to reason in formal or logic. Well, that's a theme that's also found in Hilbert's epistemology. He often repeats the claim that Hilbert's intuitively grasped meta-language is a prerequisite of all scientific thinking, understanding, and communication. And that's a part of the tremendous appeal of Hilbert's formalism. It was this wonderful idea that I can use a meta-language that's so simple and definite that it's really needed to engage in any serious thinking at all. So that's sort of transcendentally justified, and I'm going to use that to prove the consistency of analysis. So there's something very epistemologically similar going on with Church's approach there. Church's correspondent of what Hilbert calls the object language are the propositions of formal logic, the ones that Church says are invented because of their use in describing and systematizing facts of experience or observation. So for Church, like Hilbert, formal language consists of undefined terms as well as postulates or axioms that define the primitives and define the rest of the system as a formal structure. So this is another point of divergence from Russell, whose language of principles of mathematics is really just English enhanced with mathematical notation. And in Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, the language is not a formal system, but is a meaningful notation for propositions and propositional functions. Whereas Church now is much more in the spirit of Hilbert. In these early papers, he presents a fully specified formal system in which the primitive terms are undefined in reference, except that they're implicitly defined by the postulates or axioms. So let me just give one example, but since we've talked about it, it's going to be so important in this project, which is the lambda operator. So just for people who haven't seen this before, let me give an example due to Kleene. Kleene says that the occurrence of the numerical successor function in the sentence, the successor of X is primitive or recursive, designates a particular function. We're talking about the successor function in the ordinary intuitive sense. And we allow ourselves to do that by using the lambda operator to build an expression that designates the successor function simply by doing variable binding. Basically, the lambda operator binds a variable and really doesn't do anything else. And so we can bind this variable here with that lambda operator, and then we can encase it in brackets, and just a more elegant notation is to replace the outer brackets with a dot. So think of that dot as a bracket that takes scope over this whole expression. Lambda abstracts are governed by several rules of inference. I'm only going to mention two. We have lambda contraction. So a lambda expression of this form, one can just take the argument and knock out the variable. There's no need for a variable binding anymore. And one ends up with this. That's called beta reduction or lambda contraction. And then lambda expansion is simply the opposite inference. And these are together referred to by Church as lambda conversion. And so we can see immediately this is a very elegant notation for functions. Let's take the identity function. We can simply write the identity function like this. We take the argument, substitute it in for the variable, and knock out the variable binding, and we just get the argument back. Yeah, so that's obviously identity. And this is a replication. Or we take the argument, knock out these two variables here. Sorry, substitute in for these two variables here, knock out the lambda binder, and we get the argument and a copy of it. So it's just some very simple examples of functions you can name using the lambda calculus. Now we're sort of running out of time, so I'm not going to say too much about the details of Church's object language. I'll just mention that there's a very natural question which arises in it, which is that Church allows what's called unrestricted comprehension in his object language. Basically, it means that for every propositional function, there exists a corresponding class and the things that are arguments of that function. And so this is what led to Russell's paradox in Frege's his system. So there's a very natural question of how Church proposes to avoid Russell's paradox. And I just want to show you this because it will see how Church's proposal is very different from Hilbert's in this respect. Church's diagnosis of Russell's paradox is that it can be blocked in his formal system by axioms defining partial functions. They take at least one argument, but are undefined for certain other arguments. So with the result that we abandon the law of excluded middle. So in an untyped lambda calculus, compound functions can be applied to themselves. So if we were to permit unrestricted lambda expansion, we can get a formula that designates the Russellian function that does not apply to itself. So that's a lambda name for the function that doesn't apply to itself. We call that R. Okay, so now by application, because we don't have types, we can apply R to R, expressing that R applies to itself. That's premise one. Then by substitution of synonyms, well, R is simply this, so we can substitute that in for R. Then by lambda contraction, we can substitute R in for these two occurrences of X, and we get this, not RR. And now we can go the other way. By lambda expansion, we can perform lambda expansion on this to get 4. Then by substitution of synonyms again, we get R applied to R, and that's Russell's paradox. However, because R is an example of a function that is undefined for a given argument, namely itself, it's neither true nor false, but meaningless, and the law of excluded middle does not apply. So that's just a very simple way of seeing the main difference between Church's proposal and Hilbert's. Hilbert retains classical logic, but restricts quantification. You cannot quantify over infinite sets. Church, on the other hand, retains classical quantification, but restricts excluded middle, and thus gives up classical logic. So that's just a tiny bit of information about the formalism. So now I'm going to show how Church's philosophy leads him into conventionalism. The intended application of a logical system, I take it that this is, I'm not the professional logician here, but I take it that this is sort of a truism, something I've observed. The intended application of a formalism can serve as a motivation for the properties of the formal structure. But the problem is it doesn't determine them uniquely. And so Church gives the following example. More than one abstract geometry can be used to describe space, where space is the intended application. And then Church goes on, there exists undoubtedly more than one formal system whose use as a logic is feasible. And that these systems, one may be more pleasing or convenient than another, but it cannot be said that one is right and the other is wrong. So Church's early formalism, together with this observation, leads him to a partly conventionalist and pragmatist attitude towards a logic. That things start to get a bit subtle here. So at the same time, Church recognizes a notion of objective proof transcendent truth. So he says in his early paper on the law of excluded middle, he's arguing with the intuitionist here. He says it seems more in accord with our usual ideas to think of truth as a property of a proposition independently of our ability to prove it. Consequently, we take the truth of a proposition merely as an undefined term subject to certain postulates, among them, if we choose to include it, the law of excluded middle. So here the view seems to be that while there is objective truth beyond proof, it doesn't admit of an explicit definition in the formalism, and so it can only be characterized by the axioms of a formal system. Now that is actually controversial because Frege in the Begriffsschrift takes a different point of view. He thinks that notions such as truth, he agrees that they don't admit of an explicit definition, but he insists that there is still something there, and so one has to elucidate them philosophically. But Church at this point doesn't could consider that alternative. He thinks simply since truth doesn't admit of an explicit definition, it can only be characterized by the formal system. But the thing is going to be that the axioms that we want to characterize objective truth are, in Church's view, not themselves true absolutely, but they are rather pragmatic choices of the logician, governed only by the requirement of consistency. So while there is objective truth beyond proof, there is not an absolute theory-independent notion of objective truth. So this is a little slippery, so let me just say that again. While there is objective truth on Church's view, there is not an absolute theory-independent notion of objective truth. It can only be characterized by a formal system, and formal systems are partly matters of convention. So let me just, there's quite a meaty quote on this here. It is commonly recognized that it's meaningless to talk about the absolute truth of a geometric postulate, and that the choice between one or two contrary postulates must be made on the basis of simplicity and serviceability. It seems reasonable to recognize the same thing with regard to the postulates of logic, in particular the law of excluded middle, and to say on this basis that it is meaningless to talk about the truth of the law of excluded middle. I'll skip the rest of the quote, it goes on a similar theme. A further complication is that we've already seen that Church distinguishes between intuitive logic and formal logic, and he's arguing for conventionalism only about formal or logic. But the thing is that the propositions and reasoning of intuitive logic have to be developed into a precise formal theory. And we've seen reason to think that these propositions are language dependent. They speak only about expressions. So when they're supplemented by the formalization, that's when there's room for theory dependence and conventionalism. So I found this part of Church a little difficult to interpret. So I'm just going to give another piece of evidence that my interpretation might be correct, which is his attitude towards the Gödel-Gensen treatment of Heiting's his system. So Church says his denial of the law of excluded middle in Church's work is of a different sort from that which is associated with intuitionism and has been embodied in the formalism of Heiting. It is not susceptible, so far as I've been able to see, to anything like the Gödel-Gensen treatment of the Heiting system. So Gödel and Gensen were each able to provide a translation of the logical constants of intuitionistic logic without excluded middle into classical logic with excluded middle, such that all theorems of intuitionistic logic come out classically true and all unprovable formulae in intuitionism come out classically false. So that allows intuitionism to be understood from a classical point of view, although not vice versa. What Church seems to be saying is that one cannot provide a translation of his theory without excluded middle into classical logic with excluded middle in an analogous manner. And I think that's because his theory regards certain formulas as meaningless rather than false. So the reason I take this as evidence for my interpretation is this. Church's claim about the law of excluded middle is not a claim made by a classical mathematician, to understand the non-classical mathematician's notion of theoremhood from a more comprehensive classical point of view, adopted by Gödel and Gensen. Rather, it's the claim that there is no precise comprehensive point of view outside one or another formalization. And I think that's probably, that seems like evidence that although truth can be, he thinks there is a notion of objective truth, there is no absolute theory independent notion of truth. Okay, so now this view, Church goes on to talk about Ricard's paradox in an extremely good paper, and then the result he gets from it in combination with the view that I've just described leads to nihilism. So Church's presentation of Ricard's paradox is a little tricky. The way he poses it is this. So I'm used to seeing it as a version of the liar, but Church poses it as follows. How is it possible that a system of symbolic logic in which a set of all formulas is enumerable should be adequate for any branch of mathematics which deals with members of a non-enumerable set, in particular elementary number theory? So let me just try and set this up for you. Let's take single valued functions of positive whole numbers, slightly different from Ricard, and define them in Church's intuitive logic in the following way. So the function of all positive integers x such that blah, blah, and you specify a definite property of positive integers. For example, being the successor of x or being the factorial of x, which maps positive integers to other positive integers. Since the number of words in English, intuitive logic, is finite, it's easily seen that all finite sequences of words can be enumerated into a sequence. The same holds for any formal language whose vocabulary is built in an analogous way. So now consider such a formal language. We ignore all expressions that don't define definite properties of numbers. And so we find the subsequence of exactly those expressions that do define definite properties of numbers. So these should imagine that these are Church's lambda expressions. I just wanted to spare you some notation. The set of all intuitively definable functions is not enumerable. And that's because we can define a function f star by diagonalization like this. In English, this says f star is that function whose value for every number n is equal to one more than the value for any n of the function defined by the nth formal expression, this in the sequence. It follows that f star is not equal to f of n for all f sub n for all n, and that f star is not definable by any well-formed expression in our sequence. If such a definition did appear somewhere in the sequence, say as phi sub k of y, then we could substitute this in for f and get this. But then we can just put in n for k and we get the mathematically impossible equality here. So f star is a single valid function of positive integers. It's not defined by any well-formed expression in the formal language, but on the other hand, we've just defined it intuitively in terms of an expression that defines a definite property of positive integers, and that's what we did there. Church emphasizes that the argument that we just gave does not show the existence of a particular function that is intuitively definable, but not definable by any formal expression, because it's not supported by an effective construction. He gives various considerations about why this version of the Ricard paradox is not sufficiently worrying. And then he asserts his conviction that there should be a system of logic containing a formula to stand for every definable function of positive integers, and I fully believe that such systems exist. However, now he's going to supplement Ricard's argument with another one to create a problem for formalism. So he makes the demand that a formal system should be able to prove that every single valued function of positive integers is definable in the system. So we need to consider those expressions of our system that provably define functions of positive integers. So basically that just comes down to saying we consider only the expressions such that the following formal implication, the thing with 3 stars next to it, is provable. Now, regardless of whether there are finitely or infinitely many axioms and rules of inference in our system, all theorems of the system can be effectively or mechanically enumerated into a sequence if the system is specified effectively. Further, we can ignore all the theorems that aren't of the above form, as we did before, and then isolate the subsequence of exactly those theorems that are of the form of 3 stars here. And then we can effectively enumerate those, and so all provably definable functions. And in this way, we see that the provably definable functions are effectively enumerable. But the intuitively definable ones are not. And so it cannot be decided by an effective method whether a given function is provably definable. Now, I've been working on this with my friend and colleague, Harry Deutsch, and Harry pointed out to me to here already, Harry made some wisecrack that I can't remember exactly, but the point of his wisecrack was that Church has arrived at the idea with which he'll show that the decision problem for first order logic has a negative whose solution. And now very quickly, I'm just going to point out without really showing that what Church does is, rather than deriving Ricard's paradox again, what he uses it to argue for a sort of informal semantic statement of Gödel's first incompleteness theorem. So we start with the observation that we just made, that the set of theorems of this form is effectively enumerable, while the set of functions of positive integers is not. So for every effectively specified formal system, either there are intuitively definable functions for which we cannot prove a theorem of this form, in which case there are true statements that we can't prove, or there's some expression for which we can prove a theorem of this form, but which does not intuitively define a function of the positive integers, in which case we can prove a statement that's intuitively false. And so Church sums up by saying every effectively specified formal system either is inadequate to prove all theorems that are intuitively true, or suffices to prove theorems that are intuitively false. Now, this is a little uncharacteristically vague, but it can easily be sharpened up by taking a standard criterion for when a function is definable due to Mostowski and Tarski. But I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to plead for your for faith that we can derive a statement that is intuitively true, but not formally derivable, once we use the standard definition of a function being representable. So the problem is we have a formula that is unprovable, but intuitively true. And this is where Church gives a very extreme reaction. He calls the situation deplorable and nihilistic. It plainly implies that the whole program of the mathematical logician is futile. So that's a very strong statement, right? He's not only concerned that we can't provide certain branches of mathematics with the foundation in the style of Hilbert. He says the situation implies that there is no sound basis for believing there is any such thing as a logic, right? So why does it cause this extreme reaction? Well, we've seen in previous sections that there's a case for saying that intuitive logic is, in Church's view, language dependent. its propositions pertain only to thought with linguistic items. These alone are real, right? Intuitive logic is the only real part of a logic. But because we're dealing with a real but language-dependent subject, the language of logic must be given an exact description if it's to be a scientific subject rather than an article of sort of intuitive faith. This scientific exact description can only be a formalization because we're talking about the language of logic. But the problem is that this formalization takes the form of an effectively specified formal system, which Church has shown is inadequate to prove all theorems that are intuitively true. So I'd just like to end by drawing another contrast with Russell and Whitehead. So what Church has realized here is that, or is beginning to realize, that he has a failed formal system of the Hilbert type. But again, we should contrast this with Russell and Whitehead, whose language of Principia Mathematica isn't a failed formal system, but is a meaningful notation for objective propositions and propositional functions. And while the existence of a formula that is true but not provable certainly discredits a logicism, pure logicism, it does not discredit Russell and Whitehead's formal system, his system of Principia Mathematica. So here are a few papers that I used to come up with this interpretation of Church, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Oliver. Okay, now we have another round of questions and comments. Now we have Lourdes and Fabio are here, so we can return the another questions and comments that we have a few minutes ago. So Nathan Solomon, please.
Hi, Oliver, can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Nathan.
Hi, Oliver. Thank you for that wonderful talk. That was really informative. I wasn't aware that Church was early on a kind of conventionalist about logic. I take it that, so for those of you who don't know, Oliver is a former student of mine, and I'm a former student of Church, which makes Oliver, in a certain sense, a grand student of Church. Also, his collaborator, Harry Deutsch, was one of my teachers. So I take it that Church changed his view, that by the time I was his student, by the time I took his courses and, attended his lectures, he was not, in any sense that I could see, a conventionalist at all about logic. So I take it that he had a change at some point. Is that
yes,
right?
I think it was probably, there's more and more evidence that he encountered Frege, he starts to write about Frege in the very early 1940s or maybe the late 30s. But at the same time, there is something he says in 1939 that still has a whiff of conventionalism about it. But by the time he writes the review of Carnap's book,
Introduction to Semantics.
Yes, by the time, thank you. By the time he writes the review of Introduction to Semantics in the early 40s, he's already fully absorbed the Fregean point of view. But of course, also, everyone was on this journey of embracing the Hilbert program, finding these extraordinary problems in it. And, Church was one of the most important people in doing that, right? Because he proved Church's theorem. So I think this is one needs to think of this as a trajectory in which Church's theorem is also very important.
Mm-hmm. And his conventionalism earlier on, you think that was under the influence of Bernays or others?
Well, the conventionalism, I think it seems to follow for him from his view that the only way to specify, this relates to a conversation we had the other day in another talk, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. The only way to make completely precise what a logic is to formalize it. Mm-hmm. But of course, one's intuitive grasp of logic, as in other areas of mathematics, does not uniquely determine a formalization. Yes, semantics always motivates the formalization, but it doesn't determine it uniquely. And so that opens the door to conventionalism. Because he doesn't have Russell's idea that I'm simply using a notation to talk about objective propositions. There's only a very limited space of propositions that are sort of real for church at this point.
Let me ask you one more question, and then I'll stop, because I know there may be others who want to engage in this discussion. I take it that early on he thought that we could introduce a formal notation without defining the vocabulary, and that the axioms or the postulates would supply something like a definition, or at least would provide the meaning for these. Right. Again, I suspect that that wasn't his view by the time I took his courses and attended his lectures. I think he thought that you cannot uniquely fix the meanings of expression just by writing down postulates. I mean, this will constrain the meanings, I suppose. And of course, the postulates or axioms have to use some expressions whose meanings are antecedently understood, like the logical connectives, for example. Yeah. But that just writing down a bunch of postulates would not fix uniquely the meanings of the undefined expressions.
So that's a good point. And so, of course, it's natural to speculate that he also got that from Frege, right? Since we believe that that was one of Frege's main points.
Yeah, in the Julius Caesar.
Yeah, in the Foundations of Arithmetic. So actually, I would like to have a closer look and see if I can come up with any evidence that he got the idea from elsewhere.
Right.
Because I mean, of course, after formalism, that was the standard, unlogical positivist view for a while, right? Hempel, I think, defended the view extensively.
Thank you, Oliver. That was an excellent talk.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So, Axel, please.
Thank you.
Hey, Axel. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's nice to see you as well. Hello, everybody. But I hope to not disappoint you that my question is mostly clarificatory, because I don't see why it is more damning to church as it is for Russell, the discovery of the paradox. Because if for Russell, propositions are always about the world, doesn't matter if they are meta in the meta language or just in the normal language, then it would be big problem that we have these propositions that are true and they are about the world, and that still we would not be able to prove. So I still didn't get why church.
There's a great topic in Russell's studies here, right? Which is that we know for Frege's program, as far as I can see, the Gödel's first theorem, or just even the possibility of the statement that's true but unprovable, seems to torpedo Frege's idea that we can derive arithmetic from pure logic without any appeal to intuition. Right? So Frege's logicism is so admirably clear that it can be refuted in various ways. What Russell means by logicism is much, much less clear, right? So in the early stages, it seems like it is like a mechanical sausage maker. You have empirical assumptions, you put them into the machine, and then you spit out theorems, and that's why mathematics is a logic, is because it's about things implying other things, right? Later on, you have an axiom, the axiom of reducibility, that doesn't seem to be a posteriori. So in the first situation, you might have some empirical axioms. Now we have axioms of pure mathematics, as well as perhaps empirical axioms. So perhaps the axiom of infinity is a posteriori, but the axiom of reducibility isn't, right? It's one of those, you need to argue for it in the way that one argues for the axioms of set theory. They're not self-evident, but they follow from a picture of semantics that perhaps is self-evident. So by giving an analysis of semantics, then you can justify the axiom of reducibility. That's going to involve pure mathematics, probably informal mathematics, right? So yeah, what does Russell mean by logicism? I mean, he says it very strongly. you know, in that, yeah, mathematics is only logic or simply logic, but what does he really mean by that? It's not clear at all. So yeah, I wonder if there's room for, you know, just genuine informal mathematical thinking in Russell's philosophy. It's a very good topic.
I get it now why it is hard to tell what would be the consequences, but and it is much more clearer in Church's case. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ok, antes de que perdiéramos a Lourdes y a Fabio, Raimundo Morado y Alejandro Solares estaban haciendo comentarios o preguntas acerca de esa ponencia. Entonces, no sé si desean reformular, aprovechando de que Lourdes y Fabio volvieron a conectarse. Raimundo o Ale Solares.
Creo que primero estaba Raimundo, ¿no?
Ajá, no sé si Raimundo desea reformular lo que estabas preguntando antes de que se perdiera la conexión.
Creo que ya no está Raimundo.
Creo que ya no, ¿verdad? Ok, entonces, Alex Solares, no sé si deseas retomar lo que ibas a preguntar.
Bueno, sí, muchas gracias. En realidad, pues, espero que no sea un poco raro porque ya no tiene tanto que ver con la segunda parte que se acaba de discutir, sino con lo que se estaban hablando Fabio y Lourdes. Tenía que ver como con esta, entre comillas, comunicación entre asistentes de prueba o en realidad, sí, los asistentes de prueba como Coco o Isabel, donde no es claro cómo pues, pasar una prueba de uno al otro, ¿no? Me preguntaba si ciertos enfoques de traducción entre lógicas, tomando en cuenta como las lógicas subyacentes a estos asistentes de prueba, que supongo que en este sentido estaríamos hablando en lo que se conoce como no sé, como la metalógica, pero en realidad a mí me gusta más hablar en términos como el razonamiento subyacente a los asistentes de prueba. Si podía una traducción entre esas lógicas subyacentes a los asistentes de prueba, pues arrojar luz, o hay alguien que ya esté trabajando eso para ver cómo pasar de un asistente a otro en términos de estas traducciones. Y bueno, lo que se me ocurre es como para cierto trabajo que, si es que no está hecho, hay unas cosas que han trabajado en Brasil, bueno, se caracteriza la escuela brasileña por traducción entre lógicas, pero tienen una que se llaman Possible Translation Semantics, que es interesante porque es como, bueno, muchas lógicas, bueno, no muchas lógicas, una comunidad de lógicas interpreta a otra con fragmentos que, digamos, en términos laxos, uno entiende de esa que quieren traducir y en colaboración la traducen, ¿no? Digamos, hacen la analogía con la piedra esta Rosetta, ¿no? Que se ocuparon varias lenguas para descifrar lo que decía la piedra Rosetta, pero en cualquier caso, bueno, ya más sucintamente, sí hay exploración sobre cómo hacer estas suerte de traducciones de asistentes de prueba, y si es el caso, qué tipo de técnicas se utilizan en ello. Gracias.
Sí, Alejandro. Existen, no traducciones, pero sí existe comunicación entre asistentes de prueba. Es decir, hay, digamos, los formatos sí, los formatos de los scripts de prueba o de los resultados o de los certificados que arrojan ciertos asistentes de prueba se pueden traducir en otros. No tanto a nivel de la metalógica o de la lógica que están ocupando cada uno de ellos, pero sí existe comunicación entre asistentes. No he leído o no tengo más información yo al respecto de estas traducciones, pero sí existen, sí se dan, y supongo que las lógicas, digamos, podríamos embeber una lógica en otra o viceversa para poder pues comunicar o trasladar los resultados de un asistente en otro, ¿no? Pero sí existen, pero habría que también explorar esa área, ¿no?
Y
Gracias.
lo que dices, pues es algo interesante en la teoría. Yo podría hacer una traducción de la lógica de Isabel, o del núcleo de Isabel al cálculo de las construcciones, que es el núcleo de Co. Pero en realidad lo que interesa aquí es la ingeniería, ¿no? Que el asistente pueda aceptar la prueba del otro lado. Una manera de hacerlo, digo, para los que saben, es poner lo que se llama un plugin, ¿no? O algo así, ¿no? Pero entonces es como caja negra, ¿no? Que así, por ejemplo, así llaman a las... O sea, un asistente de pruebas interactivo puede llamar a un automático, a un SAT solver, ¿no? Con ciertas tácticas, pero se vuelve caja negra y entonces ahí entra una cuestión de cuál es entonces el estatus de la prueba. Porque la prueba tiene una parte que fue caja negra, ¿no? Entonces, ¿eso qué clase de prueba es? ¿No? O verificado, válida, ¿en qué sentido? Es algo, pues, también interesante, ¿no? Pero, y sí da lugar a mucha discusión.
Muchas gracias, está muy interesante. Y si tienen referencias, te las pido más tarde. Gracias.
Claro, sí.
Okay, anybody has another question about Oliver's talk? Maybe not. Well, Oliver, Lourdes, and Fabio, do you want to say, do some final remarks before we leave the session?
No, just to say thank you again to all the people here. Also, Nathan, thanks to your presence here. And just to recall the invitation for everyone here to join us in the seminar next semester. And also, we are open to collaboration between the different schools and institutes in Mexico and other parts in the world. So thanks. Oliver?
Yeah, I'd just like to please just emphasize that logicians and philosophers working elsewhere, not just at UNAM, please join us for this journey, because these are obviously very, very difficult problems. So we need to collaborate.
Pues, muchas gracias yo otra vez a todos, y yo creo que podemos poner la información del seminario también en la página de la academia, la podemos subir para invitar a los que están interesados y con nuestros contactos. Entonces, en cuanto tengan, no sé si hay algún registro, dónde lo vayan a hacer, para poder pues tener esa información y compartirla. So thank you again, and we are really delighted for all this presentation, and it will be really good to have all the information of your seminar, and we can share it with our contacts as well, and through the web page of the Academy of Logic. So thank you.
Thank you. So I am stop the live stream on YouTube and the recording now. Okay, thank you so much. I will close the session and see you next time.